Of your recent challenge, we did a video on it to Richard Dawkins, who we've had on the show. I've had conversations with. Do you think that he's an example of the reductive atheism and deliberate straw man atheism?
Oh, yes and no. You know, the thing about Dawkins is I like Dawkins and he's super smart. And I learned a lot from reading his books. And I think that Dawkins fundamentally is an intellectually honest man. I don't think he knows how to reconcile the gap between the propositional view of religion and the scientific view. Now, I think he's wrong on a variety of fronts. I don't think that his reading of the biblical corpus is particularly sophisticated. It's dismissive. Now, what Dawkins does is the same thing that Harris does, is that they're very opposed to the totalitarian proclivity, and rightly so. But they identify the totalitarian proclivity with the religious enterprise. Now, there are totalitarian proclivities within the religious enterprise, right? Because the most psychopathic tyrants will use the highest principles to justify their own self-interest. So the worst totalitarians are likely the ones who subvert religion. And that's rightfully objected to, but you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And Dawkins and Harris both underestimate the necessity of narrative, the irreducible necessity of narrative, and they don't contend with the fact of religious phenomenology, right? The religious experience as such, the instinct of meaning. Now, Harris has moved in that direction because he is a devoted meditator. And so he admits in practice that there is a religious enterprise. He doesn't like to concretize it, but partly that's because Sam knows perfectly well at some level that if he concretized his relationship with the divine, his rational mind would tear it to shreds and leave him bereft. So I have been in contact with Dawkins representatives since you made that video and since Dr. Dawkins and I have been bandying back and forth on Twitter, and there is some possibility that we will meet and discuss these things. And I would like it to be a discussion because this is not simple. And I don't think it's not the place where you want to have a defeat. I understand where Dawkins is coming from, but I think that, see, he's such an interesting person because his notion of meme is right on the threshold of the notion of archetype. If he would have pursued that, he would have entered the Jungian world because the ultimate memes are sacred stories. Now, then the question is, does the meme bear any relationship to reality? And the answer is, well, it depends on what you mean by reality. And I know that sounds like a cop-out, but it isn't, because memes that survive, you can make a perfectly reasonable argument that the memes that survive over the longest spans of times are the ones that most effectively serve the purposes of reproduction. And that's a Darwinian argument, which Dawkins should support. And I would say that the memes that have guided us, let's say the memes that are part of the biblical tradition that have lasted for at least thousands and likely tens of thousands of years, are the memes that have been selected by two processes of reproduction, right? The transmission of information, so the propagation of information as reproduction, but that have also facilitated genuine reproduction itself. And so I don't see how someone who's Darwinian in their thinking can avoid that conclusion if they take their thinking right to the logical end. Successful memes have emerged as a consequence of Darwinian competition. And so why would you not say, then they're adapted to the world, then they're microcosms of the world? Dawkins himself said that an adapted organism, he said this explicitly in a brilliant paper, an adapted organism must be a microcosm of the world. Well, we're storied organisms. So how in the world can you not derive the conclusion that what we live in is best construed as a story? I think it is. I think it's inevitable. And then the question is, well, what's the story? Well, we've been trying to figure that out since we've been able to communicate. Thousands, tens of thousands of years. And voluntary self-sacrifice, the dragon fight motif, the bearing of the cross, the voluntary bearing of the cross, that being the precondition for redemption and renewal. That's all part of that system of ideas. And I think it's inescapable.
Yes, that there would have to be some concomitant magnetism. There would, for a meme to land, for a meme to imprint. It can't sustain its own ongoing randomness and simultaneously narrativize. Those two things are those. There's a juxtaposition in that.
Another way of looking at it, you're absolutely right. Here's another way of looking at it: the stories that survive are those that are maximally adapted to the structure of human memory and communication. Obviously, because they wouldn't be remembered or transmitted. They wouldn't strike home. They wouldn't have any compelling power. So the stories have to arrange themselves so they're analogs of the biological substrate that's representing them. And that means they're an echo of, you could say, they're an echo of the soul, right? But you can make that case biologically. And I don't see any escape from it. So one of the things I've learned, for example, is that the instinct of meaning itself, it's a reflection of something the Russian neuropsychologist called the orienting reflex, the orienting response, which is the response that orients you to the emergence of new information in the environment. That grips you. It's like the burning bush. It grips you. And that grip is represented at multiple levels in the nervous system. And that grip occurs on the border between order and chaos. Like, technically speaking, that happens to be the case. You want to be somewhere where you have 1 foot in order and 1 foot in the unknown. That's the eternal dragon fight. That way you're stable enough to maintain yourself, but you're also challenging yourself enough to continue to grow and change. Meaning signifies your existence in that place, right? And that's part of the divine order. And I see absolutely no evidence in the relevant neuropsychological literature that any of that is less than biologically accurate. And I know the great literature, Jeffrey Gray's book, The Neuropsychology of Anxiety in particular, and Jaak Panksepp's Affective Neuroscience. And I've talked to many neuroscientists. What's his name now? He's the most cited neuroscientist in the world. He wrote a lot about emotional responses and entropy. I asked him specifically, his name will come to me, whether or not object perception was a micro-narrative. And he said, necessarily yes. You think about that. Every object we see is a prop in a play. At the perceptual level, that shatters empiricism. You don't see facts and objects and attribute to them meaning. You see props in a play. And the question is, well, what play are you playing? What part are you playing? There's no detaching perception from the underlying narrative. It's not technically possible.
Yes, I like that because it suggests that consciousness is the prima materia of our reality, that consciousness is the baseline, is the fundamental frequency from which secondary phenomena emerge, that this is Genesis, this is the point of origin, this is what precedes that molecular explosion that grants us all reality. Is this the way that you might conduct yourself at the